This is the most important discovery in human history, archaeological discovery in human history. Nothing even comes close.
Ancient tunnels built by giants, megalithic structures that have no explanation, strange bodies that seem to be actual gray aliens who, according to my next guest, live and or lived underground in the very same tunnels that he says was built by a lost civilization of giants. Strange, huh? Look, what you're about to see, it's not AI generated, it's not made up, it's not false, it's not conspiracy theory, it's verifiable, it's factual, and it's actually stranger than anything that the general public believes to be real, believe it or not. Now, the interview that you're about to watch, it's about the country of Peru and all the strange things that have occurred and are occurring in Peru. My next guest, Timothy Alberino, he was there. He actually spent a lot of time in Peru. He goes there regularly. He owns property in Peru. This man knows Peru inside and out, and he's uncovered some things personally. He's been there, he's investigated them, he's researched them firsthand, and what you're about to hear is just the tip of the iceberg, mind you. When it comes to the country of Peru, there are so many stories, there's so many strange things about the history and the culture that cannot be answered by mainstream academia. It actually seems like it's a place that people should know more about, yet we don't. Why is that? Because it seems like they'd rather keep you occupied with sports. They'd rather keep you preoccupied with politics. They'd rather have you picking a side, left versus right, rather than diving into the strange mysteries that are the world that we live in. When I sat down with Timothy Alberino to film this interview, let's just say I was a little bit skeptical. However, the things he told me turned out to be true. My last video, if you haven't seen it, Timothy Alberino was talking about his experiences in the country of Sardinia, and the fact that local people who lived there their entire lives were digging up the bones of giants. Actual giants, and they have been for a long time. Now, if you haven't seen that video, I'll post a link at the end of this video. You can check it out yourself. But today, we're going to take it a step further and go deeper into this mysterious place that we call reality.
In Cusco, there's a legend of a vast underground network of tunnels. These tunnels are rumored not only to run under Cusco, but under the Andes in general, for hundreds and perhaps even thousands of miles. This is known as the Chinkana. And Chinkana is a Quechua word that means the place where one gets lost. It's a labyrinth. So the Chinkana is a labyrinth. Some of the labyrinth, according to legend, is naturally occurring. In other words, it makes use of lava chambers and tunnels and natural caverns. Some of it is artificial, meaning that the tunnel was dug out and is in some cases lined with stone. There's a particular corridor of the Chinkana that is 100% artificial. It runs from beneath the Coricancha to the galleries beneath the megalithic complex of Sacsayhuaman. This corridor is known as the Chinkana Grande, and it's a legend. If you ask archaeologists, well, if you would have asked archaeologists in the past, does the Chinkana Grande exist? They'd say, no, it's a legend, it's just a myth. And the reason why they say it's a legend, and the Chinkana in general, this underground network of tunnels. Now, they'll acknowledge that there are some tunnels under Cusco. Archaeologists know this, historians know this, because the Spaniards made use of them to some degree. You can still see the entrance to some of these tunnels in the churches, specifically in the Jesuit church in the plaza in Cusco. If you go into the Jesuit church, go down to the basement, you'll see there's a hole in the ground, and you can see there's tunnels beneath the church. So back in 2019, I was in Peru working on a project with my colleague Anselm Pi Rambla and my partner Gary Haven. We were making a film series called Chasing Legends, which today you can see in my members community for those who are interested in watching that film series. But we, while in Peru, we went to Cusco, and we have a state-of-the-art GPR unit that operates off of a drone platform. And we have the capability with this unit, it's Russian technology. we have the capability to see with one of the antennas, we can see, it's a deep penetrating antenna, we can see 300 feet below the surface of the earth. The other antenna is a shallow penetrating antenna, but higher resolution. We can see about 15 feet, but we can see very high resolution. And we took our GPR unit while we were in Cusco, and we put it into a duffel bag because we didn't have permission to fly our drone or to use this technology, but we had it with us. So we put the unit in the duffel bag, and our guys carried it around the premises of the Coricancha, and we detected the tunnel, and we were able to image it in 3D. We know where the tunnel begins. And Anselm acquired another unit, the same as ours, and did the same thing. And he verified our find, and he even got a better, higher resolution scan than we did. And he was able to map a whole portion of the tunnel. Now, Anselm Pi Rambla has history in the Coricancha, and with this legend of the Chinkana. Anselm was excavating at Sacsayhuaman. I believe it was in the early 80s he was excavating at Sacsayhuaman. And by the way, as a side note, Anselm Pi Rambla is a Spanish explorer who has done extensive work in Peru. And he's a friend and colleague of mine. He and I discovered a lost city in the Andes Mountains called Tauripunku. And Anselm has conducted unprecedented excavations in Peru. He excavated in the 80s, he had permission to excavate at Sacsayhuaman. And Sacsayhuaman is one of the most impressive megalithic sites on planet Earth. And you don't just get permission to excavate at Sacsayhuaman. So Anselm was able somehow to get permission to excavate there. And he excavated in several areas. Anselm discovered proof, irrefutable proof, that the walls of Sacsayhuaman were not built by the Inca. And by extension, the rest of the megaliths in Peru. He found at the lowest levels, at the base levels of the wall, he found pre-Inca artifacts, and only pre-Inca artifacts. There were no Inca artifacts at the base of the wall, which indicates that the Inca discovered the walls of Sacsayhuaman, the megalithic site, and decided to rebuild and to refortify it and use it for their own purposes. But Anselm, while he was excavating, and this was years ago, he had his excavations going at Sacsayhuaman. He heard of the legend of the Chinkana, and he decided to go investigate. So here he's over at Sacsayhuaman with his team excavating, and he hears about the Chinkana and diverts himself and a couple of his team members to go over and investigate at the Coricancha. Well, the Coricancha is today occupied by the Dominican order of the Catholic Church. They built a cathedral and a convent over the ruins of the Coricancha, of the Inca temple. And it is called the Convent and Cathedral of Santo Domingo, Saint Dominic. It's the Dominican order. And they were seated, the Coricancha, a long time ago after the conquest, sometime in the 1500s. So the Dominican order has occupied this site for many, many years, hundreds of years. And Anselm went to the convent, to the cathedral, and decided that he would see if he could inquire about the Chinkana, this legendary tunnel, to see if it was real. So he asked the prior if the rumors were true, if the legends were true, if in fact, beneath the Coricancha and beneath the church, beneath the cathedral, which is built on top of the Coricancha today, if in fact there is an artificial tunnel, if in fact the Chinkana exists, is it real? And to his utter surprise, the prior said to him, "Yes, the legend is real. Would you like to see the tunnel?" And Anselm was flabbergasted by this proposition. And of course, he accepted. And so the prior took Anselm and a couple of his guys into the cathedral, into the main sanctuary in the cathedral. And he had them help him move an altar out of the way. So they slid this altar out of the way, and under the altar was a trap door. And they opened up the trap door, and it led down into a crypt beneath the church. So they descended into the crypt, and they're standing there in the crypt, and they have their flashlights. As they're standing in the crypt, they notice that there is a wall that's out of place. It doesn't look like the rest of the walls of the crypt. It's made of red bricks, and it's covering something up, and it's not entirely complete. There's like a gap. And Anselm asked the prior, who's down in the crypt with them, "What's this? Where does this go?" And the prior said, "That is the entrance to the Chinkana." And so Anselm walked over to it. He took his flashlight. He had a very high-powered flashlight. And he pointed his flashlight into the tunnel. So this brick wall was blocking off a tunnel, but there was some gaps in the bricks, and pointing his flashlight in the tunnel. And he could see, first of all, that the tunnel went on for a very long way. His flashlight, the light didn't get to the end. And he noticed that the tunnel was lined with the same andesite blocks as the temples in the Coricancha above. And it was shaped like the trapezoidal doorways as in the Coricancha above. Remember, they're basically in the lower levels, the bowels of the Coricancha at this point, and in the crypt of the cathedral that was built on top of it. And in the Coricancha, the doorways to the temples are these large trapezoidal doors. And the stonework, by the way, the masonry of the Coricancha is exquisite. It's beautiful. It's andesite, and it's done in the Cyclopean style. There's no mortar that's holding those walls together. And there are some interlocking parts. So it's incorporating the interlocking megalithic style, although the blocks in the Coricancha are not large. They're regular sized blocks, but it's absolutely exquisite stonemasonry. So the tunnel exists, and it's trapezoidal, and it's lined with the andesite blocks, just like in the temple. And it runs for 1 mile. And you have to understand that from the Coricancha to the megalithic complex of Sacsayhuaman, there's an elevation gain of like 1,000 feet or something. But the tunnel isn't going up, the tunnel is going straight. So the further you go, the deeper the tunnel is. So this is the point where the tunnel is most accessible, where it's closest to the surface, where it originates. The further you follow it, the deeper you are under the mountain. And so Anselm, as he's looking at this tunnel with his flashlight, he gets very excited. And he tells the prior, "This is great. I've got a team excavating at Sacsayhuaman right now. We have all the tools and equipment at Sacsayhuaman. We can bring the team and the equipment here. We can take this brick wall down and go into the Chinkana and investigate and explore it." And the priest, Anselm told me that the priest in this moment, his countenance completely changed. He was very accommodating in the beginning, but suddenly, on a dime, he became extremely hostile. And he began to shout at Anselm, and he said, "No, absolutely not. No way. I should not have shown this to you. I made a mistake. I should not have shown this to you." And then he said, "Get out. Get out of here. You're not going to come back. I made a mistake. Get out of here." And he threw Anselm and his guys out of the church. He turned on a dime. And Anselm realized it later, talking to a later prior, years later, that the priors were keeping the secret of the Chinkana. It was handed down from prior to prior. And the prior is the head priest at the convent, at the cathedral. He's the guy in charge, right? And this secret of the Chinkana was passed down through the centuries, from prior to prior. The regular priests really didn't know about it. They knew about the legend, but only the priors knew about the Chinkana. So he realized this priest, this prior, that he had made a mistake. He wasn't supposed to reveal this. For whatever reason, he did. Anselm believes that it was destiny, and that it wasn't time yet to go into the Chinkana, but that time would come. Okay, well, so Anselm, obviously, he's seen the Chinkana, and he realizes that if he can get down into the Chinkana, it would be one of the greatest archaeological discoveries in centuries, not just in Peru, anywhere. Because again, according to legend, the most important artifacts of the Inca and probably pre-Inca cultures were secreted away beneath the megalithic walls of Sacsayhuaman. And Anselm believes that the revelation of the builders of Sacsayhuaman, in other words, the identity of the builders of the megaliths in Peru is concealed under Sacsayhuaman in the galleries. There's artifacts or some kind of maybe hieroglyphs, something down there that will reveal to the world who built the megaliths in Peru. And other things as well, other things besides. This is what Anselm believes. And I don't doubt it. I personally think there may be some truth to that. Now, unquestionably, I believe that the artifacts were secreted away, that there are revelations about the Inca Empire and about the pre-Inca cultures and about the history of Peru that would demand a rewriting of elements of history in regard to Peru, aspects of the history and the conquest of Peru and all of that. However, I'm not sure how much of that is still there, because the Dominicans have had centuries. They've had access to this tunnel, to the labyrinth beneath Cusco, and specifically the galleries beneath Sacsayhuaman for centuries. And it's difficult for me to believe that having had the knowledge of the tunnel, that they would not have explored it and ransacked the treasures, if there were any, to begin with, in the galleries. So I don't know what would be left to this day. Maybe they didn't. Maybe it was too dangerous. Maybe they lacked the resources, the tools to do it properly. Maybe they thought that the tunnels were cursed. Who knows? But we do know that there have been, over the years, there have been individuals, specifically in the early 20th century, who managed to penetrate into the labyrinth, the greater Chinkana, get into those labyrinths, and make their way into the galleries beneath Sacsayhuaman. Some of the people who went into the galleries or went into the labyrinth, down into the tunnel system beneath Cusco, died. They died. They never came back out. Others reemerged, but they had lost their minds. They went mad in the tunnels. So the natives believe that the tunnels are protected or cursed to keep people out, and that if you go down into them, you're going to die or you're going to go crazy. In fact, years later, Anselm would return to Peru and miraculously obtain permission to excavate at the Coricancha, to excavate on the premises of the cathedral and convent of Santo Domingo. No one had ever been given permission like this before. It was unprecedented, and the story of how Anselm got permission is in itself wild, but it would be a digression for us today. But Anselm developed a friendship with the prior. It was a new prior. The previous one had either died or was sent somewhere else. And when Anselm went back to Peru to get permission to excavate, there was a new prior in place. And this prior was named Father Gamarra. And Gamarra was a very gentle and good-spirited man. And he was very accommodating to Anselm. And he worked with Anselm so that he could obtain permission to excavate, permission from the Ministry of Culture in Peru. And the prior heard Anselm's story that he had seen the Chinkana and was himself very interested in seeing whether or not the legend was true. Now, I think Anselm found out later that Gamarra knew the legend was true. And then he told him the following story. I think this was back in the early 20th century. Could have been in the 1800s. That's why I said the relic is 100 to 200 years old. I don't recall. But it happened that two youths somehow penetrated down into the labyrinth. They found an entrance into the tunnels. And they went down there, and they somehow managed to make their way into the galleries beneath Sacsayhuaman. And keep in mind, Sacsayhuaman are the megalithic walls up there in Cusco. One of the most impressive megalithic sites on planet Earth. And as the story goes, related to Anselm by Father Gamarra, one of these young men died in the labyrinth. He died because they got lost, obviously. They got lost. And the other managed to make his way out. Somehow, miraculously managed to make his way out. And the way it happened was Gamarra told Anselm that one day it was recorded by a previous prior, the incident was recorded, that one day the priests heard a knocking. They heard a knocking coming from somewhere in the cathedral. And they didn't know where it was coming from. They were looking all over the cathedral. Where is this strange knocking coming from? And eventually they realized that it was coming from that trap door that I mentioned earlier. And somebody was knocking on the trap door from inside the crypt. And when they opened up the trap door, it was a young man. And they lifted him out of the crypt, and the young man had in his hand this golden corn cob. And he told the prior and the priests who pulled him out of the crypt that he told them the story of how he and his friend had managed to get down into the labyrinth, that they made their way to the galleries beneath Sacsayhuaman, and that there they discovered a great treasure. And they had selected just this one piece of corn, this golden corn, from this hoard of treasure to bring back because they couldn't carry anything else, and they were lost. So obviously their primary concern was to get out of there alive. Unfortunately, the other youth, this kid's friend, died in the labyrinth because they were down there for a few days, probably died of dehydration. And this young man had gone mad. He had lost his mind. He was barely coherent, and in fact, he ended up passing away a few days later. But he had given into the hands of the previous prior, one of the previous priors, many years ago, this golden corn cob, which was melted down and forged into the crown of the Virgin and the Child. That was the story. So Anselm had proof. The priors had proof that there was still some treasure beneath Sacsayhuaman in those galleries. Now, whether or not they had gone into the galleries later on, remember, with the advent of modern technology, with the proper gear and flashlights and so forth, maybe they went in and recovered all of that treasure and took it who knows where, maybe to the Vatican, who knows. But there is a possibility that it's still there. And it's not just gold and silver, it's knowledge. That's what you have to understand. There's knowledge in the galleries beneath Sacsayhuaman. Anselm believes that once the Chinkana is penetrated, that once specifically he is able to get into those tunnels, then the secrets of the Andes are going to be revealed. What he calls, actually singular, the secret of the Andes is going to be revealed. And so it's much more than just treasure, it's knowledge. And part of the secret of the Andes is the identity of the megalith builders, because they weren't the Inca.
You are familiar with the term Nephilim.
The Nephilim?
Nephilim, a child born of an angel and a human woman.
They were giants, men of great and terrible renown.
Ask her who built the pyramids.
Well, who do you think built the pyramids?
They were giants.
You said they were giants.
I think that a lot of the important megalithic complexes around the world are connected by underground tunnels. I think that goes for Egypt, the megaliths in Egypt, in various parts of Europe, in the Middle East, and certainly in South America. I think that this is the norm. I think there's a lot of hidden structures beneath these megalithic edifices. Certainly Sacsayhuaman, and they could be more megalithic constructions under the ground, or it could be galleries. It could be caverns. It could be all kinds of tunnels that go different places and connect the complexes to other complexes. And in some cases, maybe even hundreds or thousands of miles away. There's something very interesting going on, I think, in the subterranean context of these megalithic sites. Nobody knows who built the megaliths, but we do know that they were all using the same technique, which is referred to today by archaeologists as Cyclopean masonry. And the Cyclopean style involves large stones, sometimes square or rectangular, sometimes polygonal, that are fitted together so precisely that there's no need for a bonding agent. There's no need for cement or mortar. And this kind of masonry is advanced. It's exceedingly advanced. It's not something that is easily accomplished, especially with stones that weigh sometimes in excess of 100 tons, sometimes in excess of 300 tons. These kinds of cyclopean megaliths are found all over the earth. And I think what it suggests is that either we're looking at the same builders or we're looking at different cultures who are using the same technology, who had the same knowledge. And it's very ancient. It's much more ancient than the Inca. And I think it's much more ancient than the Egyptians. I think we're looking at a technology, we're looking at knowledge that originates in the antediluvian world. So the question is, who built them? And that's a question that nobody knows. There's people out there who pretend to know, but they don't. Nobody knows. It's a complete mystery. And there are many possibilities. Of course, one of the most tantalizing possibilities is that the megaliths were built by giants. And I think that there's some truth to that. Certainly, if you talk to the Quechua people in Peru, and you ask them, who built the megaliths? Who built these massive stone walls, these massive stone foundations that you see in the Andes? Many of them will say, the giants built them. They were built by giants. So there may be some truth to that. Certainly wouldn't surprise me. However, that cannot be the only explanation. Even if that's part of the explanation, it cannot be the only explanation. Because some of the megalithic sites around the world and in Peru are not built to the proportions of giants. They're not built proportionally to the stature of gigantic people. The doorways are small. The interiors of some of these megalithic constructions would not accommodate, 9, 10, 11, 12, up to 15-foot giants. They're made for normal. They're made for people of normal stature, common stature. That's apparent when you look at the corridors, the doorways. However, there are some exceptions, Sacsayhuaman being one of them. If there's one megalithic construction that I've seen more than a few around the world, that I would be willing to concede could have been built for giants, it would be Sacsayhuaman. Because the doorways of Sacsayhuaman are very large. They could accommodate 9-foot tall giants. The stairwells are broad, and the stairs themselves seem to be spaced for people with a very long stride. Yeah, the native people were very diminutive. I mean, the Inca themselves were not very tall. I take that back. The nobility of the Inca were tall, but the Andean people who they subjugated were of very short stature. So Sacsayhuaman, in regard to its dimensions, in regard to the the doorways themselves and the corridors and the steps. Yeah, I mean, those could accommodate people of unusually large stature. But if you are confronted with a megalithic site that has narrow corridors, that has small doorways, then obviously it wasn't built for giants. Maybe built by giants, but not for giants. So it is very possible that these megalithic edifices were constructed perhaps by giants, some of them, but not for giants, not to house giants, not as habitations for giants, but rather as observatories, or as I said before, as ritualistic sites for the practicing of various rituals related to astrology, related perhaps to sorcery, astrology, things like this.
It's black magic.
No, it's black magic.
It's demonic.
Yeah, we know ancient cultures all over the world were tracking the precession of the equinox. And were basically keeping the same timepiece, which is the zodiac. We know that. Many ancient cultures around the world. And this was done for many purposes. I mean, for one thing, what they were tracking was cyclic cataclysm. And this knowledge was not proliferated among the masses, among the vulgar. It was only kept by the initiated, by the priest class and the noble class. This was the knowledge that they would be trained in. The young nobles, for example, in Peru, those who were of the royal blood, of the Inca blood, were trained by a class of very mysterious teachers who were called the Grandes Almautas. And the great Almautas is basically what they were called. And the great Almautas were the keepers of secret knowledge, were the keepers of ancient knowledge that was relayed to the Inca nobility. And so that knowledge, I believe, is fragments of knowledge that was preserved from the antediluvian world. I appreciate Graham Hancock and his research. I've read many of his books. He's, first and foremost, he's a very eloquent writer. I really enjoy his prose. And for the most part, I agree with his thesis that there was a highly advanced ancient civilization that once existed on Earth that, for whatever reason, probably due to some cataclysmic event or a series of cataclysmic events, was nearly annihilated, but that there were some survivors. I mean, I generally agree with that thesis, although I believe that a more accurate accounting of that very event, that cataclysmic event, is to be found in the pages of the Bible, and more specifically in the account of the flood of Noah, and then also in the Book of Enoch. And I would say a much more detailed explanation is the one provided in the Enochian text, First Enoch. So I recently returned from an expedition in Peru. Part of the reason why I went down there was because I was invited by Professor Roger Zuniga from the University of Ica to come and examine the so-called tridactyl beings, these three-fingered mummies that are in the possession of the university. And I accepted the invitation. And I traveled to Ica. Ica is in the desert. It's kind of between Paracas and Nazca, the Palpa area. And it's an extreme desert. I mean, it looks like the surface of Mars. It's a very interesting environment. And because it's so dry, it's one of the driest places in the world, you have extraordinarily well-preserved mummies and desiccated bodies. And it's really desiccated bodies more than mummies. So this is where you find in the Paracas, Ica, Palpa region of Peru, this is where you find a lot of the mummies the Paracas mummies and the Nazca mummies. And the Paracas mummies, when you find Paracas mummies, desiccated bodies is the correct term, because a mummy is wrapped and preserved in a different way. A desiccated body is the flesh is just dried. It's almost like you dehydrate the body, but it's much easier to refer to them as mummies than desiccated bodies. So if I say mummy, just understand these are not technically mummies, but these desiccated bodies are preserved so well. So if you find mummies related to the Nazca or Paracas culture, oftentimes you're going to find them in the fetal position, and they're going to be wrapped in burial bundles. They're going to be encased in burial bundles. And burial bundles are multiple layers of fabric. And inside the fabric is this mummy in the fetal position. And grave robbers often look for these burial bundles because it's the nobility that's buried in this fashion. And the nobility, of course, is sometimes associated with all kinds of artifacts, including gold and silver and other artifacts that can be sold on the black market. So you have grave robbers, huaqueros, they're called in Peru, who are always out there in the desert looking for these desiccated remains. And it happened that some years ago, there's the origins of the tridactyl beings, the three-fingered mummies, are convoluted. I've heard several different stories. But one of the stories is that years ago, maybe 7, 8 years ago, maybe 10 by now, some grave robbers discovered a cavern or a cave or a tunnel in which 150 three-fingered mummies had been buried. And these huaqueros extracted some of these mummies and they sold them to various individuals. Ultimately, the University of Ica was able to acquire 4. And they're not all the same. Some of these three-fingered mummies are very small. They're like 1 to 2 feet tall. Some of them are quite large, and they're in the fetal position, just like the Paracas desiccated bodies or the Nazca desiccated bodies. They're in that fetal position, and they were discovered in mummy bundles, I was told by some of the professors at the university. Although, remember, the origins are convoluted. I've heard other stories, and I think I've heard the real story, which probably won't publicize just yet. But understand that many of these things were discovered. Some are small, some are large. They look different. The similarity is that they have 3 fingers. The small ones and the large ones look different. And so when I went to the university in Ica, I examined these mummies and I approached the large one first, and it was in a case. It was in a glass case. And I was immediately struck with the sensation, let's say, that this thing was living and breathing at some time in the past. Now, I don't have any scientific reason to believe that that was in fact the case. It was just my initial reaction when I walked up to this mummy. And you have to understand, I have a firewall up. When it pertains to Central and South America, let's say this again. When it pertains to artifacts from Central and South America, I have a firewall up because there's a lot of fake stuff circulating. There's a lot of fake artifacts. I've been exposed to a lot of fake artifacts. I understand the way the markets work, and a lot of gringos are buying these artifacts thinking they're real. It's a whole industry, and there's a lot of money to be made. So, and it's rampant in Central and South America, especially artifacts related to aliens, alien artifacts. I've got a firewall. Most of that stuff is fake. And so I'm very incredulous, and I refrained from commenting on these tridactyl desiccated bodies, these 3-fingered mummies, for a very long time, because I didn't really want to comment on them until I had the opportunity to examine them up close in person. But like I said, when I walked up to the larger body, which is called Maria, which the university has, Maria/Mario, they call it now. My first impression was, I think this is real. I think this was a living, breathing entity. Now, at the university, they have Maria, which is the larger mummy, and then they have the smaller ones. The ones that were featured by Jaime Maussan, the Mexican ufologist Jaime Maussan, a couple of years ago or a year ago. He had this press briefing, which went viral on the internet because he unveiled, there were members of the Mexican Congress there, he unveiled the alien bodies there, right? The little ones that are 2 feet tall. They have 3 fingers. And the university had 2 of those. And I did not get the same impression from the small ones as I did from the large one. The anatomy of the larger mummy, and I call it a larger mummy because although it's in the fetal position, if that thing were to stand up, it would be typical stature of the natives in Peru. Probably 5'6", somewhere around 5'6", 5'7", maybe. You have to understand that, because it's dried out, it's shrunk. The anatomy of Maria, the larger mummy, looks functional to me. There's no red flags, at least my initial observations, where this looks like functional anatomy to me. Even the way that the 3-fingered hands and the 3-fingered toes, and these are very long fingers. Even the way that the bones connect to the wrists and to the ankles. It seems very natural, that the anatomical flow seems very functional to me. Whereas the smaller ones, they seem very rigid, and I don't get the same feeling. The anatomy seems off. Now, I'm not a professional. I don't work with human anatomy. I'm not a doctor. I'm not a forensic scientist. These are just my, as a layperson, my initial observations. But the small ones, they just don't look like they have functional anatomy. They don't look like they were living and breathing at some time. They look very rigid, and the joints they just look off to me. I can't imagine those things having flesh on them and walking around and actually functioning as living beings. One of them is in a seated position. It's missing its head. It's in the seated position. Again, it's very rigid. They're very rigid, the little ones. So understand that these are distinct from the larger ones. Their facial structure is totally different. The small desiccated bodies have a flat face, and they look like the aliens from the Steven Spielberg movie. I can't recall the title of it, but they look exactly like that.
E.T. phone home. Paging E.T. please phone home.
Phone home.
And just unrealistic as far as I'm concerned. But let's return to the larger mummy, Maria. Maria has some anatomical oddities that are highly intriguing to me. For example, she has an elongated skull. And I've done an extensive investigation into the elongated skulls of Paracas. And most people are familiar with those. They're all over the internet. I've held them. I've analyzed them. We even did a genetic analysis from one of the skulls, which yielded some very surprising results. We were able to get mitochondrial DNA from one of those Paracas elongated skulls, and the DNA indicates haplogroup M, which is interesting because haplogroup M has a wide distribution in Europe, Central Asia, the Middle East, and other places, but no distribution in the Americas. It is not represented at all in the Americas. It's like one of the only places where you don't find haplogroup M is precisely the haplogroup of this elongated skull, which indicates that these people migrated from over the sea. They came from somewhere else to the shores of Peru, at least members of the Paracas culture, or there was a culture that migrated and interbred with a native culture, and that resulted in the Paracas culture. Of course, Eli Marsuli did a phenomenal analysis, a much more extensive analysis of the elongated skulls in regard to the genetics. They did a genetic analysis with Mondo Gonzalez was involved in that, Chase Koletsky and others, and that was led by my colleague Eli Marsuli. And they also were able to determine that the haplogroups of the Paracas elongated skulls, the haplogroups were not. Some of the haplogroups did indicate indigenous populations in South America, but many of the haplogroups indicated Middle East, Europe, Central Asia, and so forth. So that just reinforces the idea that there was a migration and an interbreeding. And the reason why I'm talking about this is because it's going to be relevant to these, in my opinion, we're going to have some relevance here to the tridactyl beings. The tridactyls have the elongated skulls, just like the Paracas culture, just like that. And there are several of these larger tridactyls. I think there's 7, 8, maybe up to a dozen of them that are known, and many more that are unknown. And some of them have more accentuated elongated skulls. Maria's skull is slightly elongated, but it is elongated. So that's an oddity. But the most striking anomaly, anatomical anomaly, are her overly large orbital sockets, like really, really large eyes. And she has these eyelids that are divided in the middle. And so she has these large eyelids with clearly very large eyelids, very large eyes, and very, very small nose. And something that a lot of people don't realize about at least Maria, if not all of these larger specimens, is they have puckered lips. And the way that the professors explained it to me was that their lips are puckered in the way that chimpanzee lips are puckered, or gorilla lips. So this is a freakish being. Okay, assuming that this thing was alive and breathing sometime in the distant past, you would have had this elongated skull, and by the way, they don't have ears. Elongated skull, no ears, gigantic eyes, barely a nose, and puckered lips. That's what these things would have looked like. And obviously, most bizarrely of all, these 3 fingers and 3 toes, very long 3 fingers and 3 toes. Very strange indeed. But as I said, the anatomy of these large mummies seems to flow very naturally. They do not look like they're composites. In fact, the reason why I'm even interested in these mummies is because there has been extensive scientific analysis. They've been subjected to extensive scientific analysis. And the data has been published freely online. Nobody's hiding the results. And there have been several scientific teams that have come to investigate these mummies, the small ones and the large ones. There was an American team that was associated with Jaime Maussan who came, and they were led by John McDowell, a celebrated forensic investigator. And they did MRI scans, X-ray, DNA analysis. I don't know the extent of all of the testing that McDowell's team did, but the combination of all of these different teams that have analyzed the mummies have accrued all of this kind of data. Again, MRI, X-ray, DNA analysis, and other tests and other analyses besides. And universally, if you read the data and you listen to the opinion of the scientists who have examined these mummies, they all say the same thing. Now, before I say what they say, understand that McDowell, he was not given access to the small ones. He only analyzed the large ones. And what they say, so let's be specific to the large mummies. The universal conclusion about the large mummies is that they're not fake. In other words, and when they say they're not fake, what they mean is that there's nothing in the anatomy of these mummies that doesn't belong. There's no epoxy, there's no plastic, there's no, like metal wiring. There's nothing there that doesn't belong. All that's there is tissue and bone. sinew and bone. That's it, and skin. So there's nothing out of place in the anatomy. Furthermore, they all attest to the fact that the anatomy is natural. It seems to be natural. The way that the wrists, the way that the hands connect to the wrists, as I said, which was my initial observation as a layperson, the way that the feet connect to the ankles has a natural anatomical flow. The scientists, especially the American scientists, are not willing to say these things were alive and breathing, but they are willing to say they're not fake, and they suspect that they might have been alive and breathing at one time based on the anatomy. And that's what I'm willing to say at this point. I suspect that the large ones might very well have been alive and breathing. They might have been sucking air on planet Earth at some point in the distant past, walking around. They've been carbon dated to between 1,000 and I think 1,500 years ago. I think that's the time frame that these various mummies fall in, somewhere 1,200 years more or less ago, which puts them squarely in the time frame of the Procus culture. I find that to be very intriguing. And one of the most interesting things that Dr. Zuniga told me was that the DNA analysis across the board was indicating 30% human DNA, 70% anomalous. And Zuniga highlighted the fact that human beings have more, genetically speaking, have more in common with a papaya than with these tridactyl beings. We share about 40% of our DNA with a papaya, according to Dr. Zuniga. So that's very interesting. And when we talk about anomalous DNA, we're talking about DNA that does not conform to any known creature on planet Earth. It's anomalous. It's unknown. Zuniga and his colleagues at the University of Ica are unequivocally convinced that these mummies are real, in the sense that they were living and breathing, including the small ones. Now, again, my initial observation is I'm persuaded at this point, based on my initial observation of these desiccated bodies, that although I do believe the large ones very well could have been living, breathing beings, I am not persuaded that the small ones were living, breathing beings. I think, and I always reserve the right to change my mind, it's just my sense. And again, this isn't based on the data, because the professors in Peru will tell you that the data indicates that they're all real in that sense. They were all living at some point in the distant past, about 1,200 years ago. But my sense is that these smaller mummies are effigies of the larger ones, and that they were buried with the larger ones for some sort of ritualistic purpose. So they're like, you can think of them maybe as ancient dolls. They're effigies, they're facsimiles of the larger ones. And if that's the case, then they're composites of different kinds of animals, replicas of the larger ones. That's just as I keep saying, that's just my impression. Now, when I came home from Peru, I pulled up some interviews by Dr. McDowell, and I was very interested to discover that's his opinion as well. He is leaning in the direction, based on interviews I listened to him. Of him. He seems to be persuaded also that although he thinks there's a very strong possibility the large ones are real in the sense that they were living beings, the small ones appear to be dolls or effigies. So they drew this, at least the guys from the American team drew the same conclusion. Now, it's possible that the small ones are real in that sense as well, that they were also living. It's very possible. Again, Zuniga and his colleagues are totally convinced that they're all real. All 150 of them are real. And I asked him to describe some of the anatomical anomalies of both the large specimens and the small ones. And he rattled off, he began to rattle off just a very impressive list of oddities. And the beings are humanoid, generally speaking. They're humanoid, they're bipedal. But a lot of the bones and the positions of the bones and the musculature and the skin is totally divergent. It's totally different than the human species. The skin, he was telling me, is much more reptilian than human. It seems to be textured like a lizard, basically. The configuration of the rib cage, the configuration of the neck, and some of the other skeletal structure of the anatomy is quite different than ours. So it's not just that they're a little different than us. They're as he said, they're only at most 30% similar to us genetically speaking, and somewhat similar to us anatomically speaking. They're bipedal. It's been discovered that some of the specimens have eggs, literally eggs, like a reptile. And the contents of the eggs have been tested, and all of that is online, and it appears to be organic. One of the most compelling aspects of these mummies is that some of them have metallic implants. Some of the smaller mummies have metallic implants in the chest. One of the larger mummies, at least one of the larger mummies, has a metallic implant right in the center of its forehead. And these implants are made of gold, and at least one of them has a very rare alloy. It's called osmium. And osmium is relatively new in regard to our understanding of osmium, and it has a very limited use. Its utility is very limited, at least in the modern world. And we only use it, as far as I know, in communication devices. And I'm pretty sure, and I could be wrong about this, but I don't know that osmium has ever been discovered in any other ancient artifact. But it's one of the alloys in these metal implants, or at least in some of them. So what's that doing there? That's very bizarre. And something about these implants that, again, I find very compelling is that Dr. Zuniga described to me how the bone and the sinew have clearly grown over the implants, which indicates that they were implanted while this thing was alive, resulting in the bone. That's the only way that the bone would grow over the implants. So that I find that very compelling. Now, I'm not a scientist, but I was impressed by how knowledgeable and honest and sincere Dr. Zuniga was. And he wasn't aggressively trying to convince me that these things were real. He's really just fascinated by them. I mean, that's what he conveyed to me. He was genuinely fascinated, awestruck by these tridactyl beings. And he told me that he is persuaded by the data. He can't argue with the data. And because I pressed him on this, I said, do you really think the little ones are real? I mean, their anatomy is so bizarre. It doesn't seem functional to me. You know, what do I know? But as a casual observer, the anatomy of the little ones doesn't seem functional to me. And he said, I know, but all of the data indicates that they're real. And I can't argue with the data. That's what he told me. He said, I have to acquiesce to the data. So I asked him, you know, what the response of the Ministry of Culture in Peru has been. And initially it was very hostile. The Ministry of Culture was convinced that these were fakes, hoaxes, and there was an incident in which 3 of the smaller desiccated bodies were confiscated in the airport. And what I've been told, and I believe this is a proven fact at this point, is that the bodies that were confiscated, at first the press made a big deal about this in Peru and said somebody was trying to smuggle out these artifacts from Peru and they were found to be hoaxes. And that disproves all of the rest of the 150 mummies. See, they're hoaxes. I mean, and they were clearly not real. I mean, they were hoaxes. They were composites of different creatures, and I think there was epoxy in them. And but it later was proven, as far as I know, and this is what I was told in Peru, that those, and in fact, the person who was in possession of these artifacts admitted that they were facsimiles. In other words, they were models based on the actual mummies. And so the conspiracy theory is that the Ministry of Culture orchestrated this confiscation at the airport to disprove the authenticity of the mummies. Case closed. See, we dissected them. They're fake. They're all fake, right? That somebody wanted to disprove the authenticity of the other mummies. So it seems to me that there's some credibility to that story. I was told by the professors in Peru that had happened. So if in fact the confiscation of these fake alien mummies, three-fingered mummies, was orchestrated by the Ministry of Culture or somebody else, then that lends credibility to the authenticity of the mummies, of the real ones. So these are my initial thoughts. I reserve the right to change my mind. I am convinced that the larger mummies, Maria and her like, were alive at some point in the distant past, namely circa 1,200 years ago. And I do believe that they are related to the Paracas elongated skulls. My hypothesis is that assuming that these tridactyl beings were alive and breathing during the time when the Paracas culture was flourishing in Peru, that they were interbreeding with the Paracas culture, with members, individuals from the Paracas culture, and that resulted in the Paracas nobility with the elongated skulls. Now understand that many, perhaps most of the elongated skulls in Paracas, the Paracas elongated skulls, are in fact the result of cranial deformation. Let me say that again. They are the result of cradle headboarding and head binding. Artificial cranial deformation is the correct explanation for the majority of the elongated skulls. However, I am persuaded that the noble class, that the elongation of their skulls, which is much more accentuated, they have much larger craniums, is the result of a genetic variation. It's a genetic anomaly. In other words, it's natural. I'm convinced that fetuses, I've seen evidence that fetuses have been discovered with elongated skulls. And if that's true, it's case closed, because you can't cradle headboard a fetus in the womb. So if you have fetuses or really, really young newborn babies with elongated skulls, then you're looking at the product of a genetic variation. So, again, assuming that the tridactyls were real, and assuming that some of the elongated skulls, namely of the Paracas nobility, are the result of a genetic alteration, then it seems reasonable to me to infer that there was interbreeding. And that the product, the hybrid offspring of the tridactyl beings and the Paracas people, would be a noble class among the Paracas with naturally elongated skulls, and perhaps some other anatomical anomalies, oddities. That's rank speculation. It's just conjecture. But if the tridactyls are real, then I think it's perfectly plausible. And I talked to Zúñiga about this, and he had never really considered that. He was only vaguely familiar with the elongated skulls, the Procus elongated skulls, which I was a little bit surprised by that, seeing as he's a professor at the University of Ica. But he conceded that it's possible. It's possible that if they were living contemporaneously, and they were, that they might have been interbreeding. So what you're talking about here is a crypto-terrestrial species that is inhabiting the earth, concurrent with the Procus culture, to their contemporaries, and is clearly interacting with the Procus culture or the Nazca culture, because they're being buried in the fetal position, intentionally buried, and in some cases in the burial bundles. This indicates that they were alive, they died, and either the Procus or the Nazca culture buried them in the manner of the Procus and Nazca cultures, which means they were interacting with them. So the question is, what in the world are they, and where do they come from? I suspect, assuming again that they're real, I suspect that they're subterranean. There is some indication that they could be aquatic, but I suspect they're subterranean. And if they were alive 1,200 years ago, could they still be alive today? Are there still specimens of this non-human species alive today? Now, people are speculating all over the internet, and have been for the last 7 years, that these are aliens, that these are extraterrestrials. They could be. That's possible, but it's just as possible that they're crypto-terrestrial. In other words, crypto-terrestrial means that they are cryptically inhabiting the earth, that they're native to the earth and they're just hidden. They're concealed. Their existence is concealed from us. In other words, they're living inside of the earth, in the bowels of the earth, and caverns and tunnels and whatever, underground cities maybe, or maybe they're living under the oceans. Who knows? I mean, the speculation is endless here. But I do want to make it clear that it is still possible that they're hoaxes. I think it's very unlikely, because if they're hoaxes, this constitutes the greatest hoax in the history of archaeology. This is certainly the most complicated, the most complex hoax ever perpetrated, if in fact these mummies are hoaxes. I mean, the level of detail that went into them is unprecedented. And remember, there's hundreds of them. So to me, it's unlikely that they're hoaxes. So that's one possibility, that they're hoaxes. And when I say hoax, what that means is they were purposely created to be sold or to be marketed to the world as if they're real and with a financial incentive. That's a hoax. It's also possible that they're real artifacts, but they weren't real beings. What do I mean by that? It's possible that an ancient culture, such as the Procus or the Nazca, created these composite beings and buried them for some ritualistic purpose. That, in other words, the mummies are real in regard to the parts involved in the composite, right? But they weren't living, breathing beings. That's another possibility. I find that possibility to be more likely than the hoax, but in order for that to be true, you have to attribute a lot of skill to the Procus or Nazca people in creating these mummies. I mean, this wasn't a hack job. They're very intricately, the joints and all of the various anatomical constituents are very, very precisely fitted together so that they look natural. I mean, how are ancient people accomplishing that? So that one also seems unlikely. So the hoax and the ancient artifact theory both seem less likely than these things were actually living creatures. That seems to be the simplest explanation here, at least as it pertains to the larger mummies. I'm not willing to go there with the smaller mummies. So it could turn out that the smaller mummies, as I keep saying, are just as authentic as the larger ones. It could turn out that they're all hoaxes. I'm just conveying my initial observations here. It's hard to argue with the data. It really is hard to argue with that much data. That is freely available online. I mean, it's published online. The CT scans, the X-rays, the genetic analysis, it's all public knowledge at this point. It's all available to the public. So nobody's attempting to hide any of the data. And that's compelling. And it's because of the data that all of the professors I talked to in Ica are persuaded that they're totally authentic, totally real. And I was told that the Ministry of Culture is slowly coming around, slowly warming to the idea that these are in fact real, that these mummies were real living, breathing creatures, precisely because the data is accumulating. And at some point, it's going to become undeniable. It's just a tsunami of data, and which doesn't mean that they're not hoaxes. I just want to put that out there. It doesn't mean they're not hoaxes. It just means it's becoming less and less likely that these are hoaxes as the data accumulates. And what I'm conveying here, I think, is the general consensus of most of the scientists who've looked at these things. I don't think anybody yet is willing to jump out and say, these were living, breathing beings, and we need to accept them as such. But as time goes by and more data is collected, everyone's kind of moving in that direction, quietly and inevitably moving in that direction. And let's just be clear. I mean, if that's the case, this is the most important discovery in human history, archaeological discovery in human history. Nothing even comes close. We're talking about a non-human species that was living contemporaneously with the Nazca Paracas people, and that were buried in the manner of those cultures, which means they were interacting with them. That demands a rewriting of history, at least in this part of the world. And if these creatures were living and breathing in Paracas 1,200 years ago, then who's to say they weren't living and breathing in ancient Egypt or Mesopotamia? Or aren't still living and breathing under the ice in Antarctica, or something like that. I mean, all bets are off. We don't really know, and anything's possible at that point. Could they be extraterrestrials? Certainly they could be. I mean, they could be anything. Cryptoterrestrial, extraterrestrial, if they are real. There's an interesting connection between the discovery of these tridactyl mummies and something I discovered in Peru in 2019. We were in Peru working on a film project, myself, my partner Gary Haven, and our crew. And at the time, we were driving into the desert of Pisco, which is, you have the desert of Pisco, Paracas, and Ica, and the Palpa area. It's generally the same area. I mean, it's the same sort of terrain. And we were driving from the city of Pisco to this lake called Lake Morón. And at the time, we were looking for treasure. We were filming a treasure hunt, and we were looking for Inca treasure in the lake. And our route to and from the lake, we would pass an archaeological site called the Chongos necropolis. And the Chongos necropolis, it's not like it's not a roped off archaeological site. It's totally open, and it's the main feature of the site is an adobe pyramid, a large adobe pyramid, and it's in ruins, but it's an adobe pyramid. It's pretty impressive. And I remember we were driving to the lake, and I'm looking at the pyramid, and I had this intuition that there was something beneath it. And specifically, it was very specific. The intuition was that there was a tunnel beneath the pyramid. And I told my team, there's a tunnel beneath that pyramid. We need to take our GPR unit out there and drone the pyramid. We did. Our GPR team went out there. They flew the drone around the pyramid, and we discovered not one, but two massive artificial tunnels 100 feet beneath the Chongos pyramid. These tunnels are so large you could drive a semi-truck through them. And all of this is featured in a film series that's available in my community. If anybody wants to watch this, see the data, see us drone the site, and see what we discovered, you can go over to my members community. And if you're an annual subscriber, you get access to those films. And we have the 3D renderings of the tunnels through our GPR technology. And I mean, they're huge. And we have no idea how far they go. But they're there. There's 2 massive tunnels, and they're sort of crisscrossing beneath the pyramid. And understand that the Chongos necropolis, archaeologists believe that that was the center of the Procus culture. So this was built by the Procus people. And all around the Chongos necropolis, you can find elongated skulls sticking out of the sand, sticking out of the desert floor, or fragments of elongated skulls with red hair. That's one of the features of the Procus people, that they had red hair. And you find burial bundles or fragments of burial bundles all over the place, and just shards of bones just laying everywhere. It's a necropolis. It's basically a graveyard. And we detected a bunch of burial bundles, by the way, around the necropolis during our scan. We could see the burial bundles, and we could see the mummies inside of them in the fetal position. And so this is the Procus culture. And I learned later on from a particular source, this individual likely is the guy who discovered the mummies, not the Huaquero, not the grave digger, but this other guy that I've been interfacing with. He told me that in reality, the mummies were not discovered in a cavern or in a cave. They were discovered in a very large tunnel, deep underground. And I told him about what we had discovered at Chongos, and he was intrigued, to say the least. And after communicating with him for a while, by the way, he has specimens in his own collection. He has specimens himself that he's been analyzing because he discovered them or was involved in the discovery of these mummies. He's not told anybody where he's actually discovered them. He's put out misinformation so that nobody could go back and screw with the site, especially grave robbers or the Ministry of Culture. He's kept it hidden. So he's purposely seeded misinformation. This is what he told me. And he also told me that I explained to him, I expressed to him what my initial thoughts about these mummies and my hypothesis that this tridactyl species was interbreeding with the Procus people. And he was astounded because that is precisely what he believes. And furthermore, he believes that they're subterranean and that they're still alive. And he and I discussed a joint expedition into the desert to go down into the tunnels and thoroughly explore them. So that's something that let me rephrase that. I got to be careful. Let's just leave it there. So I find that very interesting. I think that I know that the tunnels exist. I detected them with my equipment. And if in fact these beings were discovered in one of these tunnels go somewhere. Where do they go? Maybe they just connect, the important cities, the Procus and Nazca people, or maybe they go to some kind of underground city. Maybe they connect to the Chinkana. And in fact, the legends in Peru regarding the Chinkana, the legends of the Quechua and the Aymara people regarding the Chinkana, is that there is a race of non-human beings inhabiting it. So it's not beyond the pale to wonder if these things are still alive and if there's some sort of underground city beneath the Andes.
So there he was, Timothy Alberino, talking about his experiences in Peru. And what separates him from most people, in my opinion, is that he's actually been there. He's actually been on the ground. He's done the research himself. He's talked to people. He's interviewed people. He's dug in that soil. He's looked for these clues. He's been there. And the crazy thing is that those beings, those mummies, those three-fingered tridactyls that he was talking about, if those turned out to be real, and there is some strange creatures that live under the earth, like he suspects, remember, he said that he believes that these creatures live and or lived in tunnels underneath the earth in Peru, possibly even the Chinkana itself. Now, you might be saying, well, how does that make any sense? How is there beings and creatures that live underground? That's the mystery itself. But here's the thing. How many different cultures around the world talk about beings that live underground? One that just comes to the top of my head right now is the stories of the ant people that the Native Americans in Southwest America talk about. The ant people who came up from the ground and shared knowledge with humanity. And also the Bible talks about beings that live underground. Paul talks about it right here where he talks about subterranean creatures, beings, entities. Okay, so this is biblical too, people. Now, what are the implications of this? Who knows? Because the way things are going now, nothing surprises me anymore. So I want to thank you guys for watching this video. Please put a comment if you haven't done so already. What do you think of my guest, Timothy Alberino? Do you believe what he's saying is true? Do you believe about these stories of these underground tunnels called the Chinkana in Peru? Do you believe that these beings, these three-fingered mummies, lived in these tunnels underground? And if you believe it's true, what are the implications? Put it in the comments. I'd love to read what you have to say. And also, if you haven't seen that other video that I did with him about the giants in Sardinia, you can watch it. It's right here. It's right on the screen right now. Click it right here. And we'll see you guys next time. God bless you all.